When you think of a medieval battlefield, perhaps you imagine knights in shining armor, banners flying, catapults being hauled across muddy roads. You may hear the clang of metal, the roar of shouted orders, or the moan of the wounded. But listen, closer beneath the clash and fury, behind the guarded perimeters of a war camp, were the muted sounds of cooking pots, crying children, whispered prayers, and the weary sighs of women. These were the camp followers, an unrecorded army in their own right. You might assume that every woman in a medieval war camp was a prostitute, and yes, some were. But that simplification erases a much broader truth. Camp followers were a diverse group of people, primarily women, but also elderly men and children who followed military campaigns to survive. Some were soldiers' wives, bound by marriage or loyalty. Others were widows displaced by war, seeking protection within the moving tide of an army. Still others were hired to provide essential services, washing clothes, cooking meals, mending torn uniforms, or nursing the wounded. They came from everywhere: weavers, English peasants, German herbalists. They weren't trained warriors, but their survival skills were often sharper than the soldiers they supported. While knights swung swords, these women lugged kettles, stirred pottage, and tried to keep children alive in mud and filth. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't clean, but it was life. Horses steaming in the cold morning air, fires sputtering beneath blackened cauldrons. The smell, fleas and lice were constant companions. Camp followers didn't have tents unless they were particularly resourceful or connected. Most huddled under carts or fashioned lean-tos from branches and canvas. In rain they sat in mud. In winter they froze, and yet they endured. Some women gave birth on these fields. There are accounts, though rare and filtered through the judgmental pens of monks, of babies born beside the Thames during campaigns, wrapped in the mother's cloak while arrows flew overhead. Camp followers cooked, nursed, foraged, and sometimes fought. Their roles blurred lines, and the evening warming a soldier's cot. Many were unofficial medics, applying knowledge passed down through generations. They used garlic poultices, honey salves, and boiling wine for cleansing wounds. They knew which mushrooms numbed pain and which could end it. Some carried dried yarrow or angelica root tied in cloth, believed to stop bleeding or purify infected cuts. They were also traders, bartering cloth, trinkets, or food. In some camps, a makeshift marketplace would spring up selling everything from boiled eggs to iron nails. In these small exchanges, life resembled something familiar, something not entirely shaped by violence. Now we come to the topic you were probably waiting for. A few might shift partners as campaigns moved. For many, these relationships were transactional but also protective. A woman who shared a soldier's tent was less likely to be assaulted by others, of course. And there were women who never consented but were taken all the same. War blurred lines, and consent was often a gray, unseen casualty. But the Church tried to intervene. Synods issued declarations. Kings signed edicts forbidding women in camps. The results? Largely ignored. Edward III tried to bar women from his campaign in France. A month later, he lifted the ban when his troops refused to march without them. Armies needed these women, but hated to admit it. But unofficially, they knew that camp followers kept morale up and, sometimes, the soldiers alive. so compromises were made. In the Burgundian army, for example, records show that each company of 200 men was allowed 20 to 30 legitimate women wives or laundresses. Anyone else? Of course, these tokens were easily forged or sold. It's worth noting that many chroniclers barely mention these women, or do so only to mock or condemn them. Their voices have largely been lost to time. What we know, we glean from fines issued, rules broken, and the occasional scandal reported. What of the children? Some were born during campaigns. Some were dragged along in cradles, hung from carts. Age 10, serving as a messenger during the siege of Rouen. He wasn't paid. His mother was a washerwoman. Together, they followed the army for 2 years. War was a cradle and a crucible. Childhood didn't last long here. Boys might be recruited as pages or drummers. Girls were often expected to cook, clean, or worse. No schools. History, for centuries, has preferred to focus on kings, knights, and conquests. The poor, the dirty, the female, they were erased, deemed unworthy of record. But here's the truth. Without these women, many armies would have starved, frozen, or turned on each other in despair. They were not warriors. They wielded no swords, but they endured the same hardships and often more. So here you are, lying in the muddy shadows of a medieval siege, wrapped in a stolen cloak, listening to the sobs of a nearby child and the snoring of drunk mercenaries. You are a woman of no rank, no name in the chronicles here. But how long can that last? How long can someone survive a war they never chose to join? When the armies moved, they did so with noise, dust, and disarray. Behind the clanking armor and rallying horns trailed the quieter procession camp followers, walking on foot, burdened with possessions, babies on hips, and eyes set on the horizon. Their march wasn't for glory, but for survival. But staying close to power, even in its most brutal form, always comes at a cost. Throughout the 13th to 15th centuries, European rulers and military leaders issued periodic bans on women in camps. The logic was framed as moral, but the motivations were strategic: maintain discipline, prevent disease, and keep soldiers focused. Edward I of England, for example, issued proclamations banning loose women from following his campaigns. Philip II of France attempted similar measures. The Holy Roman Empire tried to confine women to clearly marked sections of the baggage train. But the practice never worked entirely. Why? Because these women were necessary. Armies needed food, firewood, clothing, laundry, sexual release, and spiritual reassurance. Camp followers supplied all of this, however unofficially. Their presence brought tension. They were indispensable and yet condemned, needed but scapegoated. Some commanders created zones of toleration. In 15th century Burgundy, female camp followers were given designated quarters, physically separate from the main tents, but within reach. These zones were marked by wooden signs, often near the rear of the camp, behind livestock and latrines. They were not protected spaces, but holding areas. Outside of them, a woman could be punished, sometimes whipped, shaved, or expelled. Still, they came to exist within a medieval army camp. Tents, no approaching the baggage carts, UNBIDDEN. No dealings with enemy prisoners, no brewing of spirits without permission, no wandering unescorted into soldier quarters unless invited. Breaking these rules could be dangerous. In some campaigns, Women were subject to summary punishment, flogging, stocks, or banishment. A few chroniclers report harsher consequences, mutilation, or even execution, though such penalties were rare and mostly symbolic threats. If accused of theft, a woman might be tied to a cartwheel and whipped in view of the troops. If accused of only the vulnerable were disciplined. The powerful remained untouched. If a soldier fell sick, it was easy to blame a woman. Women were suspected of witchcraft, poisoning, or bringing unclean spirits. The term camp fever was applied loosely, often to typhus or dysentery, but its spiritual cause was thought to be immorality. Church authorities railed against sin among the tents. They claimed that armies failed in battle because of lustful acts behind the front lines. Priests preached sermons about the wrath of God, citing Sodom and Gomorrah. Famine, it was the fault of fornication, disease, surely the result of loose women. In response, commanders were pressured to make examples. Some burned clothing believed to be tainted. Others conducted rituals, sprinkling holy water or chanting over sections of the camp. These moments were more about fear than health. Hygiene was poorly understood, but morality was enforced with fervor, and yet the double standard endured. A man could visit a brothel and suffer little consequence. A woman accused of promiscuity might be branded. This was a world where a female body was both desired and despised. Still, women adapted. Some formed relationships with officers or high-ranking knights, securing better tents, more food, and protection. These women were sometimes referred to half-mockingly, half-enviously as ladies of the pavilion. Others used skills midwifery, herbalism, or needlework to gain status. A few acted as intermediaries between soldiers and locals, translating, bartering, or spying. In rare cases, a camp follower could rise in influence. Take the case of a woman known only as Marjorie of the Iron Cauldron, mentioned in a 14th-century Burgundian quartermaster's account. She began as a laundress, but became the de facto quartermaster's assistant, tracking supplies and rationing grain. Her name appears beside line items in the ledger: cloth Marjorie approved, meat cart Marjorie's allocation. Though we know nothing more of her fate, her presence in these records hints at the invisible scaffolding women provided. No discussion of medieval war camps can ignore the shadow of sexual violence. It was widespread, often unrecorded, and deeply normalized. Camp followers, especially those without strong connections to male protectors, were vulnerable. During chaotic moments, retreats, sieges, or drunken celebrations, women could be assaulted without consequence. Some soldiers saw women as spoils of war. Others justified violence under the assumption that camp followers were already fallen. This cruel logic made protection conditional and inconsistent. There were moments of pushback. A French knight, Geoffroy de Charny, wrote in his chivalric manual that a true knight should defend the weak, especially women, and abstain from low behavior. But these ideals rarely trickled down to the muddy outskirts of war. Churchmen, when they wrote about such things, often blamed the victims. A woman raped might be described as led astray by Satan or accused of enticing her attacker. This is why so many stories remain unwritten ears by shame, silence, or death. It's important to remember, not all women in war camps were equally vulnerable. A noblewoman traveling with her husband might have a tent, attendance, and protection. Her diary might survive. her letters preserved. Her misfortunes, if any, would be chronicled with solemn sympathy. But the average camp follower, peasant, a widow, a refugee, was never named, and yet class wasn't an absolute shield. There are reports of knights' widows reduced to begging. In the 1360s, one such woman, Eleanor of Brigeau, petitioned the English crown for her husband's back pay. She'd traveled with his company for years. He died at Poitiers. She was left with 3 children and no money. Her request was denied. No pension, no shelter, so even proximity to rank didn't guarantee safety. Survival depended not just on who you were, but who you knew and what you could trade. They carried saints, medallions, rosaries, and small relics. In a world ruled by uncertainty, spiritual protection mattered. Women often led prayers for the wounded or recited psalms as soldiers died. Some claimed visions of saints or angels warning of ambush. A few acted as unofficial chaplains to other women, especially during childbirth or illness. In the Crusader camps, women sometimes joined Mass alongside knights. Chroniclers noted with disdain that women took communion, sometimes barefoot, weeping. But even here, faith was policed. A woman who prayed too often might be mocked. One who claimed visions might be accused of heresy or witchcraft. Still, they persisted. They sang hymns while stirring stew. They lit candles for the dead. They whispered Latin phrases over wounded limbs. They did what they could, where they were, with what little they had, because most of these women were illiterate. Their stories survive only in fragments. A merchant's record in Florence lists a payment to Alina for washing the banners and linens of the commander. A footnote in a monk's chronicle describes a girl of no name who nursed the dying through winter fever. A French quartermaster lists a casualty, Isabeau, trampled by horse near the grain carts, buried by the river. These are not glorious tales. They are not romantic or grand, but they are real. And in their quiet persistence, they reveal the scaffolding of every medieval army. No campaign succeeded without its baggage train, and no baggage train survived without its women. They walked behind the knights. They walked behind the carts. They walked behind history itself, but they were there miles and miles of steps, trudging through mud, cradling children, boiling beans, and binding wounds. No monuments were built for them, no epic poems penned, but their work echoed in every victory and soothed every defeat. Still, the question lingers. What happened to these women when the war ended? When the flags were folded and the soldiers returned home, did the camp followers vanish into obscurity, or did they carry war with them forever? War ends not with a trumpet, but with the quiet settling of dust. Men march home if they survive. Some return as heroes, others as ghosts. Flags are furled, swords sheathed, and histories written. But what of the women who walked behind them? What of the camp followers when the fighting stopped? At the conclusion of a campaign, military structure quickly unraveled. Mercenaries disbanded, supplies dwindled, and orders ceased. With no more meals to cook, no wounds to dress, and no coin left to trade, camp followers were often abandoned. Sometimes they were driven out. In 1361, after the Treaty of Bretigny, English and French forces disbanded thousands of soldiers. The formal armies had no place for the hundreds if not thousands of women and children who had followed them for years. Local towns, fearful of crime and disease, closed their gates. Church leaders preached sermons condemning wandering women of sin. And so the camp followers dispersed fields, ruins. Some joined the wandering bands of unemployed soldiers called routiers. Others tried to reintegrate into villages, often unsuccessfully. A woman who had served a war camp was viewed with suspicion. Where had she been? What had she done? Was she still clean? Could she still be trusted? There were no veterans' pensions for them, no medals, only silence. In English records from the late 14th century, a new phrase begins to appear. Masterless women. It's an ominous term. In a society rigidly defined by hierarchy, a person without a master was a threat anchored, unpredictable, ungoverned. Some former camp followers fell into this category. They had no husbands, no fathers, no affiliations. Many were widows. Some had children of uncertain parentage. They were fined for loitering, for vagrancy, for enticing men, even when no evidence was offered in London. Court records from 1374 describe 3 such women found without lawful trade, loitering near the bishop's gate, suspected of harlotry. They were whipped and expelled from the city. Their names are listed: Agnes, Mirabel, and Asut. No family names, no fates recorded. But this term, masterless, was more than a legal designation. It was a condemnation, a mark of moral and social isolation. Still, not all endings were grim. Some women reintegrated. In France, widows of soldiers occasionally petitioned local lords for land or tools to restart life. A rare few were granted leases or small garden plots. In the German states, church-run hospitals sometimes admitted elderly camp followers as nurses or caretakers. Their battlefield experience made them uniquely skilled at wound care and infection. Control skills born of desperation, but recognized in peacetime. And in even rarer instances, women opened alehouses or became unofficial community healers. These lives were quiet, invisible to chroniclers, but they hint at the resilience behind the suffering. One record from Cologne mentions Frau Elsa, a former laundress who operated a bathhouse on the Rhine. She was known for her herbal steam baths and quiet hand, according to an anonymous scribe. While the bathhouse later closed under suspicion of immorality, the entry remains a footnote to a life lived on the margins, yet not forgotten entirely. What of the children born in camps? These were the sons and daughters of soldiers, strangers, or men whose names were long buried. Many were born without formal recognition, outside the structures of church or state. Some were raised on the move, taught to beg or barter. Others were given over to monasteries or orphanages. In times of famine, a child might be abandoned by a riverbank or church, gate-trapped in a tattered cloak, perhaps with a note or coin. But not all were lost. There are scattered, stories few, and faint of camp-born children who grew into service roles. Some became grooms, stable boys, cooks. A few, through luck or cunning, entered the lower rungs of military or civic life. Still, their origins carried stigma. The term bastard of the field appeared in late medieval slang, cruel phrase that combined illegitimacy with perceived filth. It became a taunt, sometimes even a legal slur. Yet, here again, we see history's refusal to record the full spectrum of experience. We know so little about what these children thought, felt, or dreamed. What lullabies were sung to them in tent shadows? What hopes did they cling to in war's aftermath? the record is mostly silence, as chroniclers set about writing the glories of battles crazy. Agincourt, Poitiers, they had little interest in those who cooked the meals and buried the dead. The women of the war camps became invisible. Even when their presence was undeniable, it was couched in disdain. Geoffrey Chaucer, writing in the late 14th century, makes mention of a wandering wench of war, as if such women were figures of parody. Monks, too, condemned camp sluts and field hags in their moral sermons. The historian Froissart, who detailed so much of the 100 Years' War, rarely mentioned women unless they were noble or scandalous. The rest were background noise, but absence from the record is not the same as absence from reality. The very fact that rules were made to regulate women, that punishments were issued, that rumors spread, all of this confirms their presence. They were real, they were many, they mattered, but they weren't remembered. Today, we might see their descendants in refugee camps, in war zones, in the long convoys of displaced people trailing the edges of modern conflict. The dynamic hasn't changed much. Where there is war, there are civilians who orbit its machinery, women who follow because they must, not because they choose to. They cook, they tend the injured, they trade favors for protection. They carry children through burned fields. History repeats itself not as epic, but as endurance. And yet, there's a slow, growing recognition. In recent decades, scholars have begun to explore these forgotten figures. New readings of military records, church logs, and tax rolls have uncovered faint traces of their lives. It's painstaking work finding one name in a ledger, one mention in a letter, but it matters because it gives voice to the voiceless. Let's imagine. Now, the final night of a campaign. The battle is done. The victors are preparing to return. The defeated are burying their dead. And the camp followers, those who survive, gather for a last meal. There is no ceremony, just silence, and a shared sense that something is ending. A woman stirs a pot of barley. Another plats her daughter's hair. A third counts the last of her coins, wondering where to go next. They look to the horizon, not with joy or sorrow, but with weariness. They know what's coming: suspicion, hunger, wandering, but they also know something else, that they endured what others could not, that they kept men alive, that they mattered, even if no one says so. And when the fires are doused and the carts roll on, their footsteps are the last to fade into the dust. The camp follower will never have a statue. No square will bear her name. But she walked beside every knight, every mercenary, every general who claimed greatness. Her legacy is not in monuments, but in memory, in the slow reclaiming of history from silence. So now, centuries later, can we truly say we understand war if we forget those who lived in its shadow, carrying burdens that never made it into the tales of glory? By the flicker of oil lamps and the muttering of foreign tongues, behind the roaring fires of siege camps, there existed a different kind of war, front one not of swords and shields, but of coin, control, and flesh. Welcome to the brothels of the battlefield, often forgotten, frequently condemned, yet quietly sanctioned. These institutions became a curious cornerstone of medieval military life, an intersection of lust, law, and logistics. The 100 Years' War, 1337 to 1453, was not a single conflict, but a tangled series of campaigns, truces, and betrayals spanning more than a century. Between England and France, it dragged on through generations. shaping everything from royal succession to military technology. But long campaigns brought more than knights and squires to foreign soil. They brought boredom, desire, and a craving for something familiar. For many soldiers, sex was not merely pleasure, it was a brief return to the rhythms of life before war. And so, the brothel became an institution. And, surprisingly, it was often legal. You might expect that the medieval church, with its thunderous condemnations of sin, would stamp out prostitution in war camps. But it didn't. Not entirely. Instead, the church and state developed a strange equilibrium. Prostitution was labeled a necessary evil. Better, they reasoned, for soldiers to indulge in structured, regulated environments than in the chaos of rape or illicit liaisons. St. Augustine's ancient idea that prostitution served as a societal sewer carried over into policy. Priests and bishops didn't approve of brothels, but they tolerated them, especially when political or military concerns loomed larger. In some towns, brothels even paid tithes to the church. So while clerics preached abstinence in sermons, armies built brothels within walking distance of the main encampment. The contradiction was never resolved, only managed. Let's be clear. There was a formal structure to all of this. By the mid-14th century, English and French armies began incorporating regulated military brothels into their logistical planning. They were sometimes referred to as stew houses, from the word stew or bath, and were expected to serve soldiers exclusively by staffed by women with tokens of permission, operate under rules set by commanders or civic authorities. In some cases, the women had to undergo inspections to ensure they were clean. Of course, medical knowledge was rudimentary. Diseases like syphilis and gonorrhea were misunderstood or misattributed to demonic punishment or hot humors. Each brothel typically had a madam who reported to a quartermaster or captain. Her role was part managerial, part enforcer, and part negotiator. Rules might include: no soldier may assault a woman under penalty of flogging. Payment must be rendered before service. No weapons permitted inside. No multiple soldiers per woman. Hours of operation often sunset to midnight. Fines from rule violations often went to the commanding officers or, in rare cases, to the local church. Some brothels were even mobile, set up in wagons or collapsible tents that could move with the army. In the retinue of Edward the Black Prince during his Gascony campaign, records hint at such arrangements, though the language is veiled in euphemism. Some were locals, coerced or tempted by coin. Others were women who had followed the army from earlier campaigns, widows, refugees, or desperate young girls. A few were forcibly conscripted. Others came voluntarily, believing it safer than scavenging alone in war-torn villages. The motivations were never simple. For many, brothel work meant food, shelter, and relative protection. Within the brutal context of medieval war, this could feel like security. Some women developed relationships with repeat clients. Nicknames, shared stories, even emotional attachments were not uncommon. A soldier might leave a token behind, an emblem, a badge, a handkerchief as a sign of return. Others suffered silently. Assaults still happened, especially when officers looked the other way. A woman who protested too loudly might be dismissed, or worse. There was no true justice. Yet, among the brothel women, there was often a hidden network of mutual aid. They shared food, watched one another's backs, hid the sick, tended to wounds the medics wouldn't treat. They were not friends, necessarily, but they were bound by shared survival. Money flowed through battlefield brothels, like water through a cracked barrel. A soldier might earn a few pennies per week. A visit to the brothel could cost half of that. Some bartered instead: wine, stolen goods, or favors. A few brothels accepted foreign coin or tokens issued by commanding officers. Prices were flexible. A night during a siege might be triple the cost of one in peacetime. Scarcity raised stakes. So did hunger, boredom, and fear. There are records from the 1420s where prostitutes demanded double wages for service during plague outbreaks. Soldiers paid anyway. Loneliness trumped logic, and for commanders, brothels served a dual economic function: morale, control. Idle men with options were less likely to revolt. Revenue stream fines, licenses, and taxes flowed upward. Some campaigns even budgeted for brothels. That's right, funds were allocated for their construction and staffing, just as for blacksmiths and cooks. But it wasn't sustainable. By the mid-15th century, the spread of venereal disease became impossible to ignore. What we now call syphilis and gonorrhea tore through camps, especially as campaigns dragged into years. Symptoms were horrifying: sores, madness, decay. Treatments included mercury rubs or bloodletting, neither effective. Brothels were blamed. Suddenly, the necessary evil looked more like a direct threat. Church officials renewed their warnings. Commanders began shutting brothels or limiting access. Moral panic spread. In some regions, suspected prostitutes were rounded up, publicly whipped, or branded with hot irons. But the soldiers protested. Some mutinied. A few commanders relented. The pendulum swung back and forth between tolerance and rejection, use and denial. In reality, brothels never fully disappeared. They merely went underground, or were renamed bathing houses, bakehouses, or chapel quarters. In ledgers, the desires of men remained constant. Only the language changed. So now, imagine walking through a medieval war camp at dusk. The air is thick with smoke. Dogs bark. Laughter echoes from the edge of the tents. A makeshift curtain flutters in the breeze. Behind it, a woman waits, tired, perhaps afraid, but ready to barter her body for coin. She is licensed. She is condemned. She is essential. And tomorrow, if the trumpets sound and the horses are saddled, she may have to pack her linens, fold her canvas, and follow once more into another town, another camp, another shadow of another war. But how did the church reconcile this ongoing hypocrisy? What did women truly gain or lose by working in these sanctioned brothels? The church was supposed to be the soul of Christendom, the guiding moral force in a world ravaged by chaos and war. But when faced with the raw needs of armies, the hierarchy of heaven often bent to the rhythms of the battlefield. By the 14th century, the spiritual guardians of Europe had developed a peculiar kind of blindness, one that allowed them to denounce vice from the pulpit while quietly benefiting from it. Behind the scenes, and nowhere was this contradiction more evident than in the military brothels of the 100 Years' War. In theory, prostitution was a mortal sin, yet in practice, the church frequently taxed it. In cities like Avignon and Paris, ecclesiastical authorities collected fees from registered brothels. These levies were justified as a way to control and limit sin. But the truth was simpler. It was profitable. The records show it plainly. In 1355, during a lull in the war, the Bishop of Rouen levied a flat tax on every house of lewdness operating within proximity of the English army. Half the income went to the bishop's table. The other half funded church renovations, priest-sessually. Those traveling with armies were caught in an impossible loop. They were expected to minister to the troops, hear confessions, offer communion, tried to enforce abstinence, publicly excommunicating soldiers who visited prostitutes. Others quietly gave penance for higher accepting coin in exchange for lighter sentences. 3 Ave Marias and an extra tithe was all it took, in some cases, to absolve a knight for a night of paid indulgence. One priest, writing in a 1380 campaign diary, confessed, "It is better, I am told, for the sin to be licensed than for it to be wild." I do not agree. But who listens to a priest in a camp of wolves? Before major battles, Crécy, Poitiers, Agincourt soldiers lined up for confession. These were solemn moments. A man who had spent the night in a sanctioned brothel might, just hours later, kneel in the mud, cross himself, and seek absolution before plunging a sword into another man's chest. This wasn't hypocrisy as we understand it. It was normal. Sin was a daily currency, traded and forgiven. Morality was transactional. The church allowed the cycle to continue, and the brothels quietly operated under this system. In some camps, madams even employed camp confessors, lay priests or monks who offered absolution at discounted prices. This was not officially sanctioned, but it happened. So the very institution that declared brothels immoral also profited from them, as either temptress or virgin, sinner or saint. There was no in-between. In the brothel, this dichotomy found its cruelest expression. Theologically, the burden of sin fell disproportionately on the woman. Men were seen as weakened by temptation. Women were viewed as the source of temptation. The logic was circular. A man who visited a prostitute had fallen. Yes, but he was seduced. A woman who sold herself had chosen evil and led others into damnation. In this way, brothel women were both cause and symptom of moral decay. They were rarely pitied. More often, they were hated and feared. Church texts of the time warned that sleeping with such a woman could lead to impotence, madness, or spiritual corruption. And yet, they were everywhere. The contradiction was never resolved. During the war, countless towns erected shrines to the Virgin Mary, pleading for protection from plague, invasion, or famine. These statues often stood just blocks from the brothels. It's worth pausing here in the same town. A man might kneel before Mary in the morning, then visit a prostitute that night, never acknowledging the chasm between the two women he encountered. But for brothel women, Mary was not simply unreachable, she was used against them. Sermons likened their impurity to her purity. They were condemned by contrast, and yet some brothel women prayed to Mary anyway. Accounts survive of women clutching rosaries behind drawn curtains, of madams keeping candles lit to saints, of whispered hymns sung between clients. These were not signs of hypocrisy. They were signs of complexity of women navigating faith in a world that had weaponized it against them. Some believed they could still be saved. Others prayed for protection. A few, perhaps, prayed for the strength to endure another night. Though brothels were sanctioned in many campaigns, they did not survive every regime. When towns were conquered or reconquered, the first to suffer were often the brothel women. Accused of fraternizing with the enemy, they were easy scapegoats. In 1419, when Rouen fell to the English, local brothel workers were rounded up. Some were fined, others were stripped, a few disappeared entirely. Later that year, the English established their own regulated brothels, populated not by the previous workers, but by women brought in from surrounding towns. The cycle repeated: use, discard, replace. There were no protections, no rights. In every case, the brothel existed at the pleasure of power, and power changed hands frequently. While official records barely mention the brothels, they lived on in songs and gossip. Soldiers sang ribald tunes about ladies of the lance and sisters of the saddle. These songs, usually vulgar and mocking, hinted at real women now lost to history. One ballad from a Gascon campaign in the 1370s told of sweet Jean of the Tent Row, who cooked with thyme and comforted men. Her name appears nowhere else, but in that line we glimpse a life. Even in folklore, traces remain. In some regions, old buildings said to have housed brothels were labeled haunted, as if the shame of their use lingered. Local children were warned not to play there. The sin still walks, they said, and in whispered jokes among clerics, brothel workers became punchlines, heretics of the hips, or abbesses of the back tent. These phrases, cruel though they are, confirm that the women were present, visible, enough to be mocked, though not remembered, occasionally. Yes, in the 1440s, the city of Bordeaux attempted to register all brothel women, assigning them tokens and offering limited medical care. The experiment failed. Too many soldiers preferred unregulated services, too many madams refused inspections, and disease still spread. Later attempts by the church to shut down brothels altogether also faltered. The need remained. The brothels returned. In some places, women themselves resisted reforms, not because they wanted to continue the trade, but because the alternative was starvation. A banned brothel meant no income, and no income meant death. So the system limped on, unstable, unspoken, but always there. Imagine then a woman standing at the edge of a battlefield. Behind her, the fires of a brothel flicker. Before her, the banners of war rise once more. She has been called sinner, temptress, comfort, devil, mother. She has endured sermons, diseases, and the fists of drunk men. She has earned nothing but silver coins and condemnation, and yet she remains because someone must feed the soldiers' hunger for more than food, and someone must carry the shame they refuse to name. But did these women truly have any power over their choices, or were they merely surviving within a system too vast to defy? When the armies moved on, when the trumpets fell silent, and the dead were buried beneath foreign earth, the brothels were dismantled, their curtains folded, their women left behind. Some would be forgotten, others remembered only in insult. But their labor, their presence, and their pain shaped a side of history that never made it into the chronicles. This is their quiet reckoning. Most records fall silent after a battle. The generals retreat to their castles. The scribes pack their ledgers. The brothels, once tolerated, vanish into euphemism or denial. For the women, it was rarely a return home. Home, for many, no longer existed. Their villages had been burned, their families scattered. Even if they returned, They bore the mark of disgrace, spoken or unspoken, in some towns. Red sashes, black hoods, a ribbon pinned to their tunic. The aim was shame. They were no longer considered marriageable nor trustworthy. Some found work in city bathhouses, others in ale taverns or weaving houses. A few entered convents, necessarily out of religious devotion, but because it was the only place that offered shelter. But even the church imposed barriers. Nuns were wary of women stained by flesh. Some convents had strict codes: no former prostitutes, no women with children, no one who had traveled with armies. The brothel worker was thus caught in purgatory, no longer of the battlefield, but not welcome in peace. She was an instrument of war, now discarded. Inevitably, war bore children, and so did the brothels. These children, often fatherless, often unnamed, fell into the most precarious positions. In medieval society, some were abandoned at monasteries, at the doorsteps of hospitals, or into the woods. A few were raised by the women themselves, hidden away in the margins of town life. Records from a Conventran hospital in Calais list 3 infants born to women of the tents. In 1412, one died within a week. One was taken by a local wet nurse. The third simply disappears from the register. Those who survived often carried no last name. In some parishes, their baptismal records list them as Filius Nullius, child of no one. Many were raised with labor, not love. The boys might become squires or laborers. The girls, if not married young, often entered the same cycle their mothers had. Poverty narrowed futures quickly. Still, a few defied the odds. A 15th-century Bordeaux guild roll lists a boy named Thomas, born of the fields, who became a cooper's apprentice. He later married and paid dues like any other citizen. Perhaps his mother was a brothel worker, perhaps not. We'll never know, but Thomas reminds us some threads survived the loom. As the 100 Years' War dragged toward its end, chroniclers began compiling its lessons. They wrote of kings and treaties. They mapped victories and losses. They quoted generals. They traced bloodlines, and they omitted the brothels. In some chronicles, women were mentioned only in the context of enemy treachery or divine punishment. Brothels were dismissed as necessary shames or blamed for outbreaks of plague. The silence was intentional. There was no reward in remembering these women, no glory, no legacy to claim. The very people who benefited from their presence had the most to gain from their erasure. So, over decades and centuries, the brothel women of the battlefield faded from historical view. What remained were rumors, legends, jokes in taverns, scowls from pulpits, and yet they were there. Their fingerprints were on every campaign. Their labor served every army. Their suffering went unpaid and unburied. Modern archaeology occasionally stumbles upon hints near old battlefield sites. Excavations sometimes reveal bones of women buried hastily or unceremoniously. Shards of rosaries, needlework tools, charcoal-drawn tokens of saints tucked into graves in some rare digs. Makeshift rings made of copper have been found, along with beads or amulets. These weren't trophies, they were talismans, carried for protection, lost in the chaos of movement and fear. None are labeled brothel worker, but their context on the edges of camps. In hastily dug burial trenches suggests the forgotten women of the army's underworld. more telling still, are the absence of personal belongings, the lack of recorded names, the lack of stone markers. These are the silences of history, louder than any monument. Despite this, the women endured in filth, in fear, in forced roles, and fraught choices they endured. Some formed families of their own choosing, building small networks of women who watched out for each other. Others bartered knowledge, learning to read, to heal, to interpret the rhythms of camps and warlords. Their strategies were invisible but effective. They listened at tent flaps. They hid during purges. They memorized troop movements. They knew who to avoid and when. They survived what even hardened soldiers could not: disease, displacement, sexual violence, abandonment, and in that survival, there is a kind of defiant legacy. These were women who outlasted the banners and the battle hymns, who knew that their bodies were seen as tools, but made them weapons of endurance, not saints, not sinners, survivors. Even today, military brothels exist in new forms, under new names. Modern armies have faced similar dilemmas: how to handle the presence of sex work near bases, how to manage issues of morality versus morale, how to balance legality and humanity. In some countries, regulated systems still exist. In others, they are denied but quietly tolerated. And, as in the past, the women involved bear the weight of shame without the benefits of protection. The same language persists: necessary evil, fallen woman, morale management, licensed relief. The systems have changed, but the core questions remain. Who owns the body in times of war? What does society owe to those it uses and discards? And how long must a survivor wait to be seen? Let us imagine one last evening in the fading years of the 100 Years' War. The air is damp, the tents are torn, the fires sputter. The soldiers are drunk on borrowed time in a dimly lit brothel tent. A woman folds her linens. She has packed her meager belongings. The army is disbanding. Her coin is thin. Her next destination uncertain. She has served men who called themselves heroes. She has heard their boasts, nursed their wounds, and endured their cruelties. She carries no weapons, but she carries stories. But in quiet ritual lighting, a single stub of candle to the Virgin she still believes might listen. Then she walks into the night. No fanfare, no memory, just another woman leaving behind the war she never chose to be part of. They were never knighted, never named in songs, but they walked alongside history in its shadow, carrying the burdens no one else would claim. And now that we've looked behind the canvas flaps and drawn aside the veils of time, we must ask, can we ever truly understand history if we don't make room for those it tried to forget? In the golden glow of the medieval imagination, the knight stands, tall shining armor, noble steed, and chivalrous ideals. But few ever mention the figure who quietly shadowed every knight, the page. Before a man became a knight, he was a page. Before he held a sword, he held a towel. Before he rode into battle, he learned to polish boots, recite poetry, and sleep on cold stone floors beside the hearth. But behind the romance of this apprenticeship lies a much more complicated world, one of obedience, control, closeness, and sometimes things left unspoken. At around the age of 7 or 8, noble boys were sent away from home, delivered to another noble household or castle. This practice wasn't punishment, It was tradition. It taught boys discipline, loyalty, and the social skills required for elite life. They became pages' servants in training, grooms, messengers, and companions. Their goal, to eventually rise to the rank of squire, and perhaps, if fortune allowed, to knighthood. But the road was long. A page's duties were often menial, waking before dawn, carrying messages between chambers, assisting at table, and running errands across the sprawling halls of castles or into the dusty corners of war camps. They also dressed their knight, learned basic Latin, practiced swordplay with wooden sticks, and memorized courtly etiquette. They were expected to be well-spoken, alert, pious, and obedient. A page's life was not their own. Their days were structured, their behavior monitored. Punishments could be harsh. Praise was rare. Each page was assigned to a knight or nobleman, and the relationship was layered. The knight was mentor, master, and moral compass. He taught the page how to fight, how to pray, how to hold himself in court. But he also controlled the page's life entirely, from meals to punishments to social standing. In public, this bond was strictly hierarchical, but in private, it could become complex. The knight often relied on the page for everything: clothes, messages, emotional comfort. In campaigns, pages were the first to rise and the last to sleep. They cleaned armor, tended horses, and occasionally stood beside the knight in battle, armed with only a dagger. Some pages saw their knight as a father figure. Others feared him. A few formed bonds so tight they remained loyal even beyond service. But in this intensely male space, where physical closeness and emotional dependence were normalized, other dynamics sometimes emerged. The medieval world did not use terms like sexual orientation. Affection between men, physical and emotional, was often expressed without suspicion. Pages and knights shared chambers, sometimes beds. They bathed together. They traveled alone. This does not mean all such relationships were sexual. Most were not, but the line between discipline and domination, between affection and exploitation, was thin-end, frequently crossed. Legal records and church complaints from the 13th–15th centuries occasionally reference inappropriate contact between masters and pages. The language is vague, often euphemistic: undue familiarity, corruption of youth, improper tutelage. One such complaint from a French bishopric in 1384 accused a knight of keeping a page in his private tent after hours with no clear cause. The page was 14, the knight was 41. No charges were filed. In another case from Burgundy, a lord's page accused his master of unrelenting indecency and ran away. He was caught and flogged for breaking an oath of service, not for what he alleged. The church condemned such behavior harshly in theory, but looked away in practice, especially when knights were wealthy, powerful, or successful in battle. But not all intimacy was coercive. There are poetic letters written by older knights to their former pages, filled with genuine affection. One English knight wrote, "In 1422, you were the light of the tent when the nights turned cold. I pray you serve your next master with the same honesty and grace you gifted me. Was it love? Was it memory? Was it grooming?" The ambiguity is part of what makes the history both revealing and discomforting. Yet we must not define the entire institution of knighthood and pagehood through this lens. Most pages were apprentices, and their education was real. They learned to read chronicles, write reports, tend to wounds, and calculate supply needs. A well-trained page could grow into a valuable squire and eventually a formidable knight. Many of the greatest warriors of the period began as pages in foreign courts. These boys also learned social strategy, how to speak to nobles, how to remain silent when needed, how to detect favor or danger in the shift of a lord's tone. This kind of learning was as important as swordplay in some cases. A page could rise higher than his birth allowed us, especially if his knight had no heirs or took a special liking to him. Patronage was powerful, so were secrets. A knight might promote a page to squire, give him land, or arrange a marriage. The page, in turn, often became his knight's most loyal defender. But what happened when that knight died? Pages weren't supposed to fight, but they often did. When knights fell, it was the page who ran into danger to drag them away. When enemies breached the tents, it was the page who tried to hide his master's coat of arms. When sieges went on for months, it was the page who foraged for food or snuck into enemy lines with messages. They were brave, not because they were honored for it, but because they had no choice. In the Battle of Crécy, Saint-Celeu, a French page reportedly died protecting his master's fallen body from looters. No name is recorded, just the phrase, "a boy with no shield." The anonymity of these boys is perhaps the cruelest fact of their lives. They were part of everything yet named in nothing. The world of pages was one of obedience and conformity. Any rebellion was crushed early, any independent thought discouraged. This was not accidental. A page was trained to serve, to internalize hierarchy, to see violence as noble and submission as a virtue. This prepared him to become a knight, but it also created generations of men conditioned to dominate and obey in equal measure. Some pages, once knighted, repeated the same patterns on their own pages. Others broke from tradition, but quietly. Public defiance of custom was rare and dangerous. The emotional toll of this system is unknowable, but one can imagine a boy, aged 12, cleaning blood from his knight's blade, hearing screams outside the tent, clutching a prayer charm, and wondering what kind of man he was being asked to become. So now you sit on a straw mat beside a roaring fire in a war camp. You're 12 years old, your hands are blistered from polishing a sword you'll never wield, and your master has told you to keep quiet tonight, just as he always does. You want to ask questions, you want to go home, but home is a place you barely remember. Tomorrow, you'll saddle his horse, you'll scrub his shirt, you'll fetch a note from the steward and hope not to be kicked by a drunken squire, and you'll wonder, when does a boy become a man? When does obedience stop being a virtue? Inside the tent, the knight is silent. His page kneels at his feet, unlacing a leather boot caked in dried blood. Outside, the soldiers drink and sing, but here, in the quiet of duty and expectation, something else lingers, a weight that is not named, a loyalty that is not questioned, an intimacy that is never spoken aloud. This is the world of medieval pagehood, not simply a training ground, but a crucible of emotion, power, and silence. The life of a knight was brutal, glory was rare, pain was constant, death was always nearby. In such an environment, emotional intimacy could be both a comfort and a vulnerability. For many nights, the page became a source of quiet reassurance, a stabilizing presence, a kind of emotional echo. He was the one person, always there, always listening, never contradicting. But this created dangerous dynamics. Some knights poured their hearts into the ears of their pages. Others used them as verbal punching bags, taking out frustrations that couldn't be expressed elsewhere. A few alternated between warmth and cruelty with alarming ease. The page, meanwhile, was trapped. He could not withdraw, could not say no. His survival and advancement depended on his ability to absorb whatever the knight needed to give. Sometimes this created deep bonds. Other times, trauma. Often, both. In the chivalric literature of the 14th and 15th centuries, there are numerous references to beloved boys, dearest companions, and soul friends. These phrases were often used to describe knights and their pages. Some of this language was stylized, symbolic, a way to express idealized loyalty. But not all letters from knights to their former pages occasionally expressed longing that blurs the line between paternal and romantic. One English knight wrote to his page, who had been transferred to another household, "Your laughter rings in my tent still. I find no rest in the eyes of these new boys. May your new master treat you gently." Other documents, more rare, show the page's voice. In one remarkable letter, a page named Martin wrote, "I served you well, but never did. I feel the warmth of your eye. May God grant I find a lord who sees me as more than a blade wiper." This dynamic one of closeness mixed with hierarchy was difficult to define, then or now. There was no vocabulary for emotional abuse, no distinction between mentorship and manipulation. Pages were owned emotionally as much as physically. In theory, yes, the church condemned any unnatural acts between men. Some knights were accused of sodomitical sins, especially by rivals eager to discredit them. Punishments varied from fines and land seizure to excommunication, but enforcement was rare, and the boundary between affection and transgression was often deliberately vague. It wasn't uncommon for pages to sleep in the same bed as their knight, especially in cold climates or small tents. It was practical, it was accepted. Happened in the dark, behind closed drapes, was almost never recorded. We're left with fragments. A steward's note in a ledger moved the boy to another chamber. The knight protested. A monk's letter. The knight's affections for his lad grew troubling to the brethren. A chronicler's remark. He favored the boy too dearly and took ill when he fled. None of this is definitive, but together they reveal a culture where boundaries were unclear and where power disguised desire as discipline. The medieval ideal of the page centered on obedience, not initiative, not bravery, not intelligence. Obedience. This was drilled into boys from the moment they entered service. Speak only when spoken to. Never contradict. Serve without question. Obedience was a measure of moral character, not just functionality. This ideal had roots in religious thought. Monastic codes, too, emphasized humility and submission. In some households, pages were expected to attend morning prayers before preparing their night's breakfast. But this culture of unquestioning loyalty left pages deeply vulnerable. They could be beaten without cause, accused without defense, used without protection. If a page resisted a command, especially in private, he could be accused of insubordination, theft, or even heresy. The word of a knight always outweighed the word of a boy. There was no appeal, and so obedience became armor, even when it hurt, even when it broke the spirit. Not all pages lived in war camps. Many served in castles, especially during peacetime. There, the experience was different, but no less structured. In castles, pages received more formal education, music, reading, writing, Latin prayers, and even dance. They learned to serve at banquets, how to speak to nobility, and how to perform courtly rituals. Yet they were still second-class inhabitants. They ate separately, slept in halls or small servant rooms, cleaned up after feasts, and fetched items. For the Lord's children, even in these environments, the knight's needs overrode all else. A page might be pulled from study to hold a mirror for his master, or made to stand still for hours while armor was inspected. One record from a French castle describes a page fainting during summer drills, then being whipped for weakness. Still, the castle life offered one advantage: witnesses. The presence of others offered some measure of protection. In the field, that veil disappeared. In war, hierarchy tightened, boundaries blurred. Pages became tools, extensions of their master's will. And when no one was watching, anything could happen. Most pages eventually became squires. A squire was a more advanced servanta fighter in training, usually in his teens. From there, some were knighted. Others were not, due to lack of means, death in battle, or the withdrawal of patronage. A few pages rose far above their birth. Through loyalty, luck, and talent, they were granted land, titles, and even court positions, but many vanished from the record. Their names appear once, in a register or a letter, and then disappear. The only legacy they left was in the memories of their masters, and those memories we cannot read. So now, in a castle's stone corridor or a muddy corner of a war tent, imagine a boy kneeling with a sword across his lap. His master sleeps nearby. The boy's hands are calloused. His eyes are tired. He doesn't know what the future holds. He only knows that to survive, he must serve well, must speak little, must not be seen unless summoned. He wonders if he is good or only useful. He wonders if his master's kindness is real or only temporary. He wonders if he will ever be free. And he wonders, when a life is built on loyalty, what remains when that loyalty is no longer needed. The page served silently. The squire fought fiercely. The knight claimed honor. But history rarely paused to ask what happened after. When the war ended, or the master died, or a boy grew into a man, what was left of the loyalty that had defined his life? This final chapter explores the transitions, the transformations, and the echoes left behind of power. The knight's death was often sudden in the field, in a duel, by disease, or ambush. For the page, it could feel like the loss of everything. If the knight had no heir, the page might be granted a weapon, a horse, or a modest pension. In rare cases, a loyal squire was knighted on the spot to defend the dying lords. Body a battlefield promotion, steeped more in urgency than ceremony. More often, the page was dismissed, sometimes returned to his family, if they still lived. Other times sent to another noble house, lower in prestige, and often simply set adrift. For a boy who had grown up in a tent, or castle hall, or by his master's side, this rupture was devastating. He had learned no trade, owned no land, knew only how to serve a man who no longer breathed. A knight's page might have trained for a future that never arrived, and yet some persisted. For those who did become knights, the process was costly and complicated. Knighthood required equipment, ceremony, and status. A suit of armor alone could cost more than a peasant family earned in 10 years. Then came the horse, the heraldry, the chainmail, the sword. Unless a lord sponsored the ceremony, a page had little chance. But some made it, especially if they had proved themselves in battle, or had earned the affection of a wealthy patron. Records survive of squires who were knighted after dragging wounded lords to safety or defending the gates during sieges. One such man, Henry of Stafford, began as a page in a Lancastrian household. In 1415, at Agincourt, he defended his dying master from 3 French horsemen. For this, he was knighted and given a modest estate in Kent. He married, had children, and died at 62. His tomb reads simply, "He served, he fought, he endured." No mention of his childhood in someone else's shadow. But for every Henry Vere, there were dozens more who never rose. Some became camp followers, themselves men without rank, floating from campaign to campaign, assisting in tents, fixing gear, and fetching orders. Others joined mercenary bands, hardened, unsentimental companies where past titles meant nothing, and loyalty was purchased by coin. A few found work as bodyguards, or porters, or city watchmen. Their training made them useful, if not respected, and some, unable to adapt, turned to crime poaching, smuggling, or thievery. The skills they had been taught, stealth, obedience, discipline, served them just as well in back alleys as in castle halls. Legal records from London's South Bank in 1460 mention a man called John the Silent, a former page-turned-thief who stole wine from a bishop's cellar. He was sentenced to lashes, not for the theft, but for falling beneath the dignity of his class. That sentence says much. He had served, he had been obedient, but once cast out, he became a reminder of what society wished to forget. Pages were rarely written about once they left service. Their names were unimportant, their roles considered transitional. Even when a former page achieved greatness, chroniclers preferred to start his story after he became a knight, as if the years of service before were a stain in literature. The page is a device, the loyal boy, the comic servant, the observer. Rarely is he the hero. The few exceptions, like Mallory's Lamorth Darthor, depict pages as innocent or tragic, destined to die or disappear before maturity. This erasure continued into modern interpretations. The romanticized knight shines alone. The page, if remembered at all, is comic relief. But the reality was more nuanced. Pages held emotional knowledge. They knew their master's fears, desires, weaknesses. They wrote letters in his name, covered for his indiscretions, calmed him when he was drunk, sat beside him as he wept. They were confidants until they weren't needed anymore. The emotional toll of pagehood is largely unrecorded, but hints remain. A few letters from former pages to aging knights suggest a kind of longing or unresolved pain. One man wrote in 1472, "You raised me in war and left me in peace. I would have stood for you still." Another, more bitter, penned, you taught me to kneel and call it honor. I do not kneel now. We'll never know how many former pages struggled with their identity shaped by obedience, deprived of autonomy, taught to seek approval at the cost of self. We do know that many chose never to take pages themselves when they became knights. Perhaps they could not stomach the reflection. Perhaps they feared becoming what their masters had been. Or perhaps they knew the burden too well and sought to break the chain. The medieval page squire knight structure influenced systems well into the early modern period. Royal courts employed gentlemen-in-waiting, many of whom fulfilled roles similar to pages dressing royals, entertaining them, managing their schedules, traveling with them. Military academies adopted elements of this model rigid hierarchy, enforced obedience, rites of passage. Even modern boarding schools in Europe reflected its discipline and rituals. The emotional conditioning of service-wear loyalty is rewarded with proximity, but not protection. Echoes in many institutions. Even today, the page may be gone, but the system he embodied remains. In graveyards across Europe, you'll find unmarked stones, no inscriptions, just weathered rock. Many of these lie near old castles, fortresses, or battlegrounds. A few are known to hold the remains of servants. Some, perhaps, were once pages. There are no heraldic crests for them, no engraved swords or banners, just silence. Yet these stones mark lives that shaped history in quiet, invisible ways. The knight may have struck the blow, but it was the page who brought the sword. The knight may have spoken the oath, but it was the page who prepared the robes, cleaned the hall, set the scene. The knight may be remembered, but the page was always there. So now, the boy is grown. He has no master, no orders. He sleeps in a rented room near the city gate. His only possessions, a blade, a pouch of coins, and a letter from a man long dead. He looks in the mirror and does not know whether he is free or simply unbound. He remembers waking before dawn, the cold water, the crack of command, the warmth of fire, the sting of betrayal. He remembers a hand on his shoulder. He remembers silence. And he wonders, when you have spent your youth in someone else's shadow, who are you when you finally stand alone? The sword and the cross, the battlefield and the altar, the knight and the priest, these symbols, so often aligned in medieval tales, were in reality often at odds, especially when it came to matters of lust. For the medieval church, lust was a sin second only to pride, a gateway to spiritual ruin, a disruption of divine order, and a stain upon the purity of Christendom. And yet, the very men fighting to defend the church's temporal power, kings, its knights, its crusaders, were routinely engaged in acts that violated its moral code. What was a priest to do when the saviors of Christendom arrived at his gate, reeking of wine and flesh? What was the church to preach when its favored sons committed the very sins it condemned? This was the central paradox of medieval Christian warfare: how to enforce morality in a world built on violence and desire. Medieval theologians, drawing from Augustine, Jerome, and later Thomas Aquinas, viewed lust not simply as immoral, but as disordering. It disrupted the soul's hierarchy, placing the body's passions above God's law. Lust, in this view, didn't merely corrupt the individual, it weakened entire communities, drawing down divine punishment through famine, plague, or military defeat. Sermons warned that a soldier who fornicated before battle might bring God's wrath upon his whole army, and yet armies kept marching. And they kept sinning. Church authorities found themselves in a perpetual state of crisis, upholding doctrine while watching it unravel in practice. Before major campaigns, bishops were called in to preach purity. They gave sermons to knights, squires, and even camp followers. These orations were dramatic, filled with biblical examples of downfall through lust. King David's affair with Bathsheba, Samson and Delilah, the fall of Sodom, the destruction of the Israelites for mingling with foreign women. But behind the drama was desperation. Many priests knew they were speaking to deaf ears. They had no real power over the men they addressed. A knight could ignore a bishop's warnings without consequence. Soldiers laughed at the fire and brimstone speeches, betting on how many times the priest would say, "Abomination." Yet the church kept preaching because it had to. Without moral authority, it feared irrelevance. Nowhere was the contradiction sharper than during the Crusades. These were holy wars sanctioned by the Pope, offered with spiritual indulgences wrapped in religious zeal. And yet, the camps of crusaders were often flooded with prostitutes, concubines, and enslaved women. Chroniclers described swarms of women following the crusader armies, not always with disapproval, but often with resignation. In the First Crusade, efforts were made to ban women entirely from camp. Richard the Lionheart's advisors issued edicts forbidding loose women from accompanying the fleet, but enforcement was weak, and exceptions were made for wives and laundresses, titles that were easily claimed, forged, or purchased. At one point, Richard's own household included a personal chaplain, a scribe, and 2 unnamed companions. None were questioned. The church condemned it all from the papal throne to the lowliest friar. But condemnation, again, was not enforcement to maintain control. The church focused on confession. Before battle, priests would walk among the men, hearing sins, offering penance. These were hurried, whispered exchanges, often transactional. "I lay with a woman last week. Do you regret it?" "I do." 3 prayers, and no more till after victory. This system became the moral escape hatch for soldiers. So long as one confessed and accepted penance, one remained in God's grace. For commanders, this was practical. Men who believed they had been spiritually cleansed fought harder. They marched with the sense that heaven was watching and would reward them. But the church's deeper goal, transforming men's behavior, was rarely met. Their letters, diaries, and treatises reveal fatigue and cynicism. One Dominican friar wrote in 1312, "I have cleansed the same soldier 7 times in 7 weeks. He beds women as he sharpens his sword." Yet the friar still showed up, still offered penance, because to withdraw was to surrender the church's claim to moral authority. Lust wasn't the only problem. War itself was deeply problematic for Christian theology. The church struggled to define just war, war that was morally permissible, defending the faith acceptable, expanding a king's territory, less so, killing infidels, depends on who defined infidel. But as warfare became routine, the church's moral calculus grew strained. How could priests bless swords in one breath and condemn lust in the next? This contradiction was especially visible in confessional manuals, books used by clergy to determine penance. One 14th-century French manual listed killing in war, not sinful, if done under king's orders; fornicating with a non-Christian woman, sinful, but lesser, Sleeping with a Christian prostitute, mortal sin. Masturbation before battle, mortal sin, for it weakens the body before holy duty. The logic was baffling even then, but it reveals a truth. The church wasn't focused on the body, it was focused on control. It could not stop war, it could not stop lust, but it could regulate them, punish them, and profit from them. Not all clergy remained in churches. Some marched with army's warrior monks, field chaplains, missionary priests. They heard confessions, celebrated mass, buried the dead, and occasionally, against all vows, took part in the sin. Rumors abound of friars found in the beds of camp women, of monks caught drinking, gambling, or even killing. These were not common, but not rare either. Some chroniclers, especially Cistercian ones, expressed disgust. Others were more forgiving. One monk wrote, "Even the shepherd may stumble in the mud when he follows his sheep into battle." The church investigated some of these incidents. A few were defrocked, but most were simply relocated. Sin among priests was treated with embarrassment. Sin among soldiers was expected. This, too, reveals the limits of doctrine in a world ruled by power and pain. So now, in a field of trampled earth and broken standards, a priest kneels in his tent. His hands are stained with ash from last rites. Outside, a woman weeps, holding a soldier's child. Drums beat in the distance. The next battle nears. He opens his prayer book and stares at the page on lust. He reads the words. He sighs, and he wonders, how does one preach purity to men made for war? And if lust is sin, then what of the blood on every soldier's hand? Inside stone-walled monasteries and candle-lit chancels, the medieval church proclaimed a world of order, chaste, disciplined, and obedient to God's design. But just outside those walls, reality burned. Armies roamed. Women followed. Soldiers sinned. And the very institution that vowed to rise above the world was, in practice, entangled in its darkest urges as battles raged. The church turned inwards, seeking not just to condemn sin, but to control the body itself, especially when that body carried the banner of Christendom. This was not merely a spiritual battle, it was psychological, political, and deeply human. By the 12th century, clerical celibacy was official doctrine in the Western Church. Priests, bishops, and monks were to remain sexually pure, married only to the church, their bodies sacred vessels, untouched by earthly desire. But enforcement was inconsistent at best. In fact, it was widely ignored. Many priests kept concubines, some had long-term partners, others visited brothels often, the same ones they later condemned from the pulpit. Parish records across France and Germany list multiple fines issued to priests for keeping a woman within the rectory, or for night visits to taverns of ill repute. In 1274, the Council of Lyon decried the stink of concubinage among the clergy and ordered a renewed crackdown, but little changed. Wealthy priests paid fines. Poor priests hid their affairs. The vow of celibacy remained more of a theatrical ideal than a lived reality. For church leadership, this created a problem of optics. How could it lead moral reform when its own shepherds sinned? The answer: deflection. Instead of addressing systemic hypocrisy, the church redirected its fire toward women. The rhetoric hardened. Church fathers began to speak not just of lust as sin, but of women as its carriers. Eve's temptation of Adam became the prototype. Mary Magdalene, though redeemed, was used as the cautionary tale. The Virgin Mary remained the unreachable ideal. In confessional manuals, women were increasingly described as snares of the devil, bait for holy men, or flesh mirrors of temptation. And this anxiety wasn't abstracted, translated into policy. Women were banned from monastic precincts, even for cooking or cleaning. Nuns were forbidden from seeing priests without a second nun present. Female pilgrims were denied entrance to certain shrines unless escorted in some towns. Prostitutes were forced to wear identifying clothing, a veil, a yellow sash, or even bells. The message was clear: women's bodies were dangerous, and that danger had to be contained, marked, or punished to manage the growing tide of sexual sin. The Church relied on penitentials' handbooks for confessors that detailed sins and their appropriate penance. These books are windows into the Church's deepest fears. They catalog human behavior with unsettling precision. Fornication with a widow, 20 days of fasting. Fornication with a prostitute, 30 days. Fornication with a nun, 1 year. Fornication with another man's wife, 7 years. Masturbation, 3 years. Mutual masturbation, 5 years. Sodomy, up to 15 years. Or pilgrimage to the Holy Land. Some sins included instructions for retesting. A penitent might be ordered to repeat confession after a month to ensure he had not relapsed. These punishments were not physical, they were spiritual and social. But in a deeply religious world, public penance could be devastating. Some were made to kneel at the church door wearing sackcloth. Others walked barefoot across town. A few were exiled, but even in these texts, enforcement was uneven. Wealthy nobles often negotiated lighter. Penensor made donations in place of pilgrimage. Some bishops accepted alms of contrition as substitutes for abstinence. In this we see again the gap between law and life, between proclamation and practice. As the 13th and 14th centuries wore on, the Church expanded its power through inquisitioner originally created to root out heresy, but quickly applied to sexual deviance as well. Inquisitors gained authority to investigate priests, nobles, and lay people suspected of moral corruption. They read letters, interrogated servants, inspected living quarters, collected rumors. Cases involving sexuality were often veiled in accusations of heresy because the Church lacked a secular means to punish lust alone. But under spiritual impurity, anything could be tried. Men accused of unnatural acts with pages or squires were sometimes investigated under these laws. So were women suspected of fornication with demons, a euphemism for sexual pleasure outside marriage. The most chilling aspect was that trials often relied on confessions extracted under threat or under actual torture, depending on the region. While not common in every diocese, these inquisitorial practices created a culture of fear. Gossip could lead to exile. A lover's betrayal could result in ruin, and always the body was at the center of suspicion. While priests were pressured to remain celibate, nuns were held to even stricter standards, surveilled, and spiritually silenced. Medieval Europe had double convents, where monks and nuns lived in separate quarters but shared a chapel. These were ripe for scandal. Many were shut down after moral concerns. But even in single-sex convents, suspicion ran high. One 14th-century bishop ordered surprise visits to all nunneries in his diocese after hearing rumors of indecency with instruments. The report notes the removal of candles, dolls, and books with too much poetry. Nuns were expected to remain not just chaste, but invisible, their voices rarely heard, their writings censored, their bodies cloaked in both fabric and shame. Yet some rebelled. A nun in Saxony ran away to marry a former monk. Another in Florence wrote erotic poetry in Latin, later destroyed. In England, Sister Joan of Farringdon was caught writing letters to a knight. She was flogged and confined to her cell for 20 years. The Church portrayed these women as anomalies, but the frequency of the punishments tells a different story. These were not isolated cases. They were evidence of a system breaking down under the weight of its own demands. By the late 14th century, the Church's moral authority had begun to fracture not from outside heretics, but from within. Priests with mistresses, bishops with secret children, abbots who built private chambers for their favorite novices. The people noticed, and they began to question. Some towns stopped reporting brothel activity. Others resisted paying tithes, citing moral decay of the clergy. A few openly mocked priests, depicting them in carnival plays as lechers, drunkards, or cowards. This public cynicism forced the Church to adopt a two-tiered response: renewed moral campaigns, more sermons, more edicts, more public penance, more secrecy, quiet transfers of disgraced priests, closed investigations, sudden retirements. This was a church trying to preserve its image while managing its internal rot. And at the heart of that rot was the unresolved paradox. How can an institution condemn human desire while being built and run by humans? So now, imagine a cloister garden at dusk. A young priest kneels in prayer, sweating in his robe, whispering Hail Marys. He has confessed the same sin 3 times this month. His superior tells him it's only temptation. He must fast, pray more, wash in cold water, and yet the thoughts return. The dream returns. The knowledge that he is not holy, but human. Outside peasants sing. A child cries. A soldier passes with a girl on his lap. The world moves on, unapologetic, and the priest asks himself, if even the holiest cannot escape the body, then is it the soul that fails, or the law that misunderstands? In sermons, the Church thundered. In cloisters, it whispered. In practice, it compromised. By the end of the 15th century, the Church in Europe had spent centuries policing the flesh, yet the world remained stubbornly carnal. Soldiers still sinned. Priests still broke vows. Women were still blamed, and the Church, unable to fully control, desired something profoundly human. It adapted, not by rewriting doctrine, not by admitting failure, but through silence, evasion, and quiet allowances. While brothels were publicly condemned, they were quietly taxed. While celibacy was preached, it was rarely enforced. While lust was branded a mortal sin, it was routinely forgiven with coin, confession, and ceremony. This was the Church's unspoken policy: maintain appearances, absorb the contradictions, and keep the machinery turning. In many towns, bishops negotiated with secular leaders to limit scandals. They closed the noisiest brothels, but left others alone. They removed priests who were too blatant in their sin, but protected those who knew how to be discreet in effect. The Church had become like any great institution under pressure, a manager of problems, not a solver of them. Its role was no longer to create saints but to regulate sinners. As doctrine grew more abstract and the church's reach extended into every corner of life, a new concept took root: spiritual adultery. This was the idea that lust, even if not acted upon, could constitute a breach of divine trust. Thoughts became sins, dreams became warnings, temptation itself was a crime of the soul. This shift allowed the church to maintain relevance, even as public behavior remained largely unchanged. It also gave rise to a flourishing market of spiritual services, confessionals staffed daily for recurring sins, paid indulgences for sexual impurity, special prayers and fasting rituals sold by friars, manuals for la people on how to combat lustful urges in silence. The church turned inward over public enforcement. But this move created new anxieties. People began to fear their own thoughts, to obsess over fleeting images, dreams, or imagined sins. Confessors wrote of men, women coming to them in tears, terrified not of what they'd done, but of what they'd almost thought. Lust, once a physical act, had become a spiritual illness, and the cure was ever more elaborate penance. At the same time, cracks in the church's authority widened. La people began forming their own devotional movements, flagellants, mystic circles, and apocalyptic sects that preached direct connection to God without clerical intermediaries. Some of these groups took a harsher stance on lust, promoting celibacy even within marriage. Others were more forgiving, emphasizing love and compassion over punishment. The church responded with caution. Some groups were absorbed, others were declared heretical, but the trend was clear. The monopoly on moral interpretation was weakening. Literacy was rising. Books were spreading. Criticism grew louder. By the late 1400s, whispers of reformation could already be heard, not just in theological circles, but among the people. Frustration with hypocrisy, anger at corruption, a hunger for coherence between belief and practice. The church's dilemma was no longer just about lust, it was about legitimacy. Once bastions of spiritual discipline, many monasteries by the late 15th century had become insular, wealthy, and morally compromised. Visitors reported seeing monks dining on meat during fast days, drinking heavily, and keeping private chambers for visitors. Papal legates investigated several prominent houses. Some were reformed, others were closed. But for many ordinary people, the sight of corpulent abbots and richly dressed friars made a mockery of church ideals. Satirical poems and woodcuts from the period lampooned monks as gluttonous, lustful, and lazy. The faithful still feared hell, but they no longer believed the church was free of it. A silent drift had begun away from the institution and toward personal faith. Despite all this, most people remained devout. They went to Mass, lit candles, named their children after saints, and they tried imperfectly, inconsistently, to live according to the teachings they were given. But they also made room for the human. They confessed, even if they sinned again. They prayed, even if they doubted. They gave alms, even as they lived in poverty. They were not hypocrites, they were real. And many priests were too flawed but earnest. Some fought corruption, others shielded the vulnerable. A few wrote letters pleading for better protections for women in their parish. This is the side of the church, often forgotten, not the institution, but the individuals within it who tried to live out faith amid chaos, temptation, and contradiction. They were the ones who stood in the mud and heard a dying soldier's last confession, who baptized children born in war, who held vigil while others slept. Their dilemma was not how to dominate the world, but how to remain human in it. In the end, the church never conquered lust. It shaped it, contained it, feared it, but it could not erase it, because lust is not merely an act. It is longing for touch, for love, for power, for connection, and longing cannot be ruled by law. The church's war on lust was never really about sin. It was about control of bodies, of behavior, of belief, and like all systems built on control, it eventually encountered a truth it could not silence, that people are not perfect. They are only ever human. So now, in a flickering chapel at midnight, a priest kneels before the altar. He has served his bishop faithfully. He has preached purity and heard countless confessions. But tonight, his thoughts drift toward a face he remembers, a moment he regrets, a temptation he never truly overcame. He whispers a prayer, not for forgiveness, but for understanding. Outside, soldiers pass. A child cries somewhere. A woman weeps alone. And the priest asks, not aloud, but deeply, was the church meant to conquer sin or to accompany those who struggle with it? History is written by generals and kings, but wars are endured by ordinary people, and among the most overlooked of all medieval participants in war were peasant wives, women of no rank, no title, and often no recorded name, who marched beside their husbands, carried their children, and dragged what little they owned from field to field. These were not camp followers in the modern sense. They were domestic followers, bringing their entire households onto the road, into the mud, and across borders where no one wanted them. They didn't come for profit. They came because they had no choice. In a world without standing armies or stable economies, military service was often compulsory, especially for peasants and low-born men. A village could be required to send 10 or 20 men for a local lord's campaign, and when a man marched, he didn't always leave his family behind. Why? There were no social services. If he left, his wife and children might starve. Villages weren't safe. Raiding parties often targeted undefended settlements. The bond of marriage was practical. Many husbands simply refused to abandon their families, and so women packed up their homes' kettles, cloaks, drying herbs, children, and walked behind the carts, beside the oxen, and sometimes beside the sword. These makeshift households traveled with everything portable: woven blankets and spare tunics, wooden bowls, knives, and thread-salted meat, or grain wrapped in cloth, fire starters, dried nettles, and wound dressings, rope, iron pots, a child's toy, made from bone chickens, if they were lucky, a child tied to their back, or carried in arms. They moved slowly. They set up small campfires far from the soldiers' tents. They boiled stew, washed linen, and tried to create a sliver of home in a world that no longer wanted homes. These were not heroic acts. They were survival strategies, and they were constant. A typical day began before dawn. Fires were lit. Water was hauled. Children were roused. Food was scraped together. As the soldiers prepared to move, the women packed hastily, often walking behind the baggage carts, where mud was deepest and space was tightest. They might walk for 10 to 20 miles a day, depending on the campaign. There were no inns, no shelter. Rain soaked through clothing. Feet blistered. Children cried. At night, They huddled beside dying fires, using cloaks as bedding. Some women gave birth on the road. Others miscarried in silence. They were not paid. They were not fed by the army. Everything came from scavenging, bartering, or begging. And yet they endured. Not really. Commanders viewed peasant wives as liabilities, slow, fragile, untrained, unclean. But soldiers tolerated them, sometimes welcomed them, because they provided cooking and laundry, childcare, sewing and mending, comfort and stability. The illusion of normal life. Some women even provided emotional ballast. They consumed the rations. These complaints appear in war records and journals, and yet no one dared expel them en masse. They were not noble. They were not official, and so they were vulnerable. When battles were lost and armies scattered, they were the first to be abandoned. Enemy soldiers rarely made distinctions. If they saw a woman in the baggage train, she was loot. If she resisted, she was punished. If she begged, she was mocked. There are reports hidden in annals, whispered in monastic records, of entire groups of peasant women being assaulted or slaughtered during retreats. One chronicler wrote, during the Burgundian campaigns, the women who followed the carts were set upon and stripped. The children were left screaming, no names, just screaming. To endure. Peasant wives learned tactics. Avoid attention. Stay near older women. Cover hair. Dress plainly. Hide valuables. Coins sewn into hymns. Herbs hidden in undergarments. Know the terrain. Where to find wild onions. Where to dig roots. Barter wisely. Trade firewood for bread. Mending for milk. Keep moving. Never linger where officers gather. Some women learned to mimic soldiers. Speech to avoid appearing too soft. Others disguised themselves as male when the risk of attack rose. And some simply grew hard emotionally, physically, spiritually. There was no room for fragility. The weak died. The bitter survived. And the children watched. War is no place for children. And yet, war was all many of them knew. These children grew up watching their fathers wield swords and their mothers boil grass into broth. They knew how to pack a cart in under 5 minutes, how to wash clothes in frozen streams, how to fall silent when strangers approached. Few were educated. Few were still baptized. They were taught to listen, to obey, to run. Some boys became errand runners, carrying messages between squadrons. Others died of fever, malnutrition, or stray arrows. One priest wrote during the English campaigns in France, a girl of 10 was seen tending to 3 siblings after her mother died. She sang to them in a dialect I did not know. There is no follow-up, no rescue, just a note in a margin. The chronicles don't mention these women, not really. They mention baggage trains. They mention disorderly elements. They blame the mob of wives for delays. But the women themselves, carved from bone, lying beside spent arrowheads, these fragments whisper. Not shout, they say. We were here. We mattered. We kept life going while death marched on. So now it is morning. The soldiers move. The horses snort. The banners rise. And behind them walks a woman wrapped in a stained cloak, holding a child who cannot stop coughing. Her husband walks ahead, sword at his side, eyes fixed forward. She says nothing. She has said it all before. In her pack is a jar of salt, a sliver of cheese, and a small bundle of dried flowers tied with string. She doesn't remember where she got them. Maybe from the last village. maybe from the last grave, but she keeps walking, because there is no home to return to, only the road. But on the ground, in the trudging columns of peasants and wives, it was something else entirely. It was the constant negotiation of loss and need, of safety and survival, of how much could be taken in, from whom in this section we enter the uncomfortable terrain of plunder and examine how peasant wives, caught between moral law and material desperation, became participants in victims. It was expected. Medieval armies were often unpaid, underfed, and poorly supplied. Looting was not a breakdown of discipline. It was part of the system. Armies were drawn into foreign lands with the promise not just of victory, but of goods, livestock, grain, clothing, tools, jewelry, bedding, furniture, and yes, people. After a town was sacked or a manor seized, the spoils were divided. Officers took the best, soldiers fought over the rest, and behind them came the baggage train, including the wives of peasant soldiers who would pick through what remained. At the edge of ruin, they found survival. It may be tempting to imagine these women as passive, but they were often active in the economy of plunder. Once a village was taken, women in the marching household might strip bedding from abandoned homes, gather wheat or flour from smashed granaries, rip clothing from the dead, boiled down fat from slaughtered animals, salvage tools, pots, or dried herbs, raid chicken coops and pig pens, collect fuel from shattered fences and door frameses. Was not cruelty. It was pragmatism. They were not paid. They had mouths to feed. They took what was unguarded, unwanted, or simply left behind. But plunder had a cost not only for the victims, but for the looters themselves, because once a woman touched a noble's tablecloth or wore a stolen tunic, she marked herself as low, as lawless, as expendable. Did these women see themselves as thieves? Most likely not. In medieval Christian morality, theft was a sin, but context mattered. To steal food to feed a child, a priest might call that necessity. To strip clothing from a corpse, a sign, but forgivable. To steal a goblet from a church altar, a mortal crime. The women on the march lived in a world of gray zones. They whispered apologies over the bodies they stripped. They made the sign of the cross before entering ruined barns. They left behind small token stones, hair ribbons, fragments of bread, as if paying spiritual debts they could not settle in coin. Some felt guilt, others felt nothing. Most simply felt tired. There are no diaries, no confessions. Only the woman carrying a stolen cloak might be mistaken for a camp cook and spared interrogation. A wife with a small cart of goods might attract a local trader and secure bread. A woman wearing a dead man's boots might survive a cold march. Property became armor. It granted movement, camouflage, leverage. It blurred the lines between beggar and merchant, between follower and wife. Some women even traded plunder, becoming small-scale peddlers of spoils. A tin spoon from one village, a length of cloth from another, a twist of sugar or dried plums. These items, meaningless in war, meant everything in the economy of the road. But property also marked women as targets. A woman with a full sack might be attacked by another woman, or by a soldier, drunk and bitter, or by villagers seeking revenge. What protected you one day could get you killed the next. Here lies the uncomfortable truth. Many peasant wives, in following their husbands across a war-ravaged landscape, became entangled in the violence, even if indirectly. they benefited from broken homes. They fed their children with stolen grain. They warmed themselves with looted cloaks. They nursed their babies under roofs that once belonged to others. Were they guilty? Were they just surviving? History offers no clean answer, but in war, there are no true bystanders, only survivors and casualties. And many women were both. When armies lost battles, or when campaigns faltered, women who had once been tolerated were often blamed. Peasant wives who had scavenged were accused of unlawful taking. Women caught with noble goods were labeled thieves. Those who dressed above their station, perhaps in a silk shawl from a looted manor, were punished for disrupting the natural order. There are court records, few, scattered, and vague, of women being flogged or exiled for carrying property above their class.